Fiancé, the one you've promised to marry. Once upon a time, I had a fiancé, but I didn't end up sharing my life with him because of my sister. I was in deep despair back then, but now I found new happiness. And I want to show my sister and my ex-fiancé just that. My name is Catherine. I'm not particularly beautiful, just an average office worker. But back then, I had a man who had promised to marry me. His name was Bob. Bob was a handsome guy, working in a reputable company, the so-called hottie. We were really happy back then. Happiness that I thought would last forever. But the cruel reality dealt me a harsh hand. I couldn't get married to Bob. The cause of it all was my sister. My sister's name is Sophie. Sophie has always been interested in fashion, and she is still as fashion conscious as ever. In fact, Sophie was always much more conscious about her appearance than me, and was always pretty. Therefore, Sophie had been popular with boys since she was in middle school. She even once was an amateur model for a fashion magazine. Because of that, Sophie dreamed of becoming a model. When I graduated from college and was working at a regular company, I was once invited to dinner by a business partner. That partner was Bob. One day, after having connected with Bob a few times and occasionally going out for meals together, something unexpected happened. That day, Bob invited me for dinner after work. Naturally, I had no reason to refuse and went out for the meal. On the way back that evening, Bob confessed his feelings for me. I was surprised at his sudden confession, but I also had feelings for him, so we ended up dating. After a year of dating, Bob proposed to me, and I was overjoyed. Of course I accepted his proposal. A few days later, Bob and I visited my parents' house to report our engagement and to greet them. My parents were, of course, thrilled. We talked about wedding plans and I was very happy, but not everyone was pleased. That person was my younger sister, Sophie. Sophie was surprised to learn that I was getting married and was even more taken aback when she saw who I was marrying. Sophie, who was more attractive and had been asked out by various men, always looked down on me, who had little romantic experience. I don't want my embarrassing sister to be known to my friends. That was what Sophie would always say. The sister who she deemed uncool was getting married before her, and to a successful man from a famous company. This seemed to hurt Sophie's pride even more. But I was completely oblivious to Sophie's feelings. I should have noticed her attitude at this point. One day, Sophie asked, "If you're going to be my brother-in-law, can we exchange contact information?" Bob and I saw no reason to refuse, so we readily agreed. Since I was about to leave my job, there were many days when I had to stay late for the transition process. Then on a day when my parents were out of town, Sophie took a certain action. In hindsight, it was probably a plan she had thought of from the beginning. Once I retired, I planned to move away from my family home and start living with Bob. She probably wanted to execute her plan while I was still at home. Sophie first called Bob to our house. "Bob, my sister suddenly came home sick. Our parents are out of town and I'm feeling uneasy being alone. Could you come over?" Sophie lied, saying that I had cut my work short due to a sudden illness. Bob, who was just about to head home from work, hurried to our house without suspecting a thing. I rushed over because I heard Catherine was ill. "Where is she?" Of course, I wasn't there. It was only natural for Bob to think so. However, Sophie confessed, "I'm sorry, Bob. I lied to you. My sister isn't sick. She's still at work." Upon hearing this, Bob didn't get angry at Sophie, but instead asked, "Why would you lie like that?" "I just really needed to talk to you, Bob," Sophie started to explain. Having wrapped up work, I reached home and was surprised. It was because Bob was there. Yet, without really questioning it, I cheerfully said, "Oh, you're here." Later, I was about to experience the most intense despair and sadness I've ever felt in my life. "Catherine, I'm sorry. I want to break up." It was sudden. I was unable to comprehend the meaning of his words immediately. "What? You're kidding, right? Break up? What do you mean?" Just as I was pressing Bob for answers, Sophie showed up. "Catherine, actually, I'm dating Sophie." "I'm sorry, Catherine. I've fallen in love with Sophie, more than you." Still confused and in disbelief, Sophie then said to me, "I'm sorry, but Bob has decided to marry me." I was totally lost. Then Sophie continued, "You might not want to attend our wedding ceremony, but do come to the reception, won't you?" All I could do after that was cry. Sophie had taken away my fiancé. I was discarded. Both my dad and mom were extremely worried. For a while, I couldn't leave my room. Since I'd already quit my job, there was nothing I could do. I received several messages from my coworkers asking when the wedding was. I told them it was going to be a simple ceremony with just family. Months later, I found myself in a strange place. Here, I'd start my life anew. I wanted to be happy again. Truly happy this time. After breaking up with Bob, I was holed up for a while, but a certain emotion was born within me. Why do I have to suffer like this? Forget that guy, and let's start over. Things progressed rapidly from there. I talked to my dad and mom, deciding to leave home and live on my own. A completely unfamiliar place, but it was a really pleasant place, rich in greenery and peaceful. My parents didn't stop me and even helped me a lot during the move. After the move, while taking a break, I heard this from my mom. A few days after you locked yourself in your room, Bob came. He told me everything that happened between you two, and then he apologized. I didn't understand why my parents were apologizing. Of course, what Bob did is unforgivable. His parents came to apologize too, even kneeling down. But we heard about Sophie as well. I know you can't forgive her, Catherine, but Sophie is also a daughter to us, my parents explained. Both my dad and mom were distressed. She had done something terrible to me. Of course, they couldn't forgive such a person. But Sophie didn't listen to them, and it seems she went to Bob. Since then, Bob had been coming to our house at the same time every day, apologizing and asking for his marriage to Sophie to be approved. Because of Bob's actions, my parents had no choice but to accept. That's why they apologized to me for accepting his marriage to Sophie. Honestly, I didn't care anymore, but I could painfully understand my parents' feelings. It's all in the past now, it's okay. Besides, I'll meet someone better in the future, I replied positively, holding back the tears. My mom was crying. My father looked apologetic, but I said to him, "When I have children, I'm going to rely on you a lot." Both my dad and mom responded with smiles. Mom was very concerned, saying, "Don't hesitate to get in touch if anything comes up." As I started getting used to my new life and had some peace of mind, I began working at a small restaurant. The staff was small in number, but the place was very bright and I really liked the friendly atmosphere everyone had. The manager was a man named Steve, who was often teased by the part-timers. Watching their banter was enjoyable and created a warm atmosphere. A few months after I started working, a fateful event that would impact my future took place. I was confessed to by Steve. It happened when he was giving me a ride home after work. To be honest, I was unsure. Steve was a really good guy. Above all, very kind. He had both the looks and the personality that would be attractive to the opposite sex, but I was still hung up on that incident. I was scared that I might be abandoned again. Steve seemed to notice my hesitation and told me that I didn't have to give an immediate answer, and he went home for the day. Things were a little awkward for a while, but thanks to the usual banter with the part-timers and Steve's kindness, I didn't fret too much. I guess my heart had already made a decision. During one break, I learned something about Steve. Turns out, Steve had been betrayed by someone he was dating and had a terrible experience at the place he worked before this restaurant. Steve and I had the same experience. We both had been betrayed by someone we loved. That day, I decided to go home with Steve so I could hear more about his story. As we were walking home, Steve shared his past. He was actually in charge of a store before he came here. But due to certain incidents, the store lost trust and ended up closing. Then Steve was held responsible and lost his job. After hearing his story, I decided to tell Steve why I came to this place. After I finished, Steve said, "You did great." He said that to me, who, despite the pain, stood up and faced forward again. I was overjoyed. And I realized that this was exactly what I wanted to hear. I did my best. I was betrayed by someone I loved and went through a tough time, but I managed to bounce back. Honestly, it was very hard. And I told Steve, "You did great too." Steve was smiling, and then I gave my answer to his confession from that day. I'm a bit of a handful, but I hope you'll be patient with me. After that, the teasing from the part-timers at the restaurant increased, but they were genuinely happy. "Congrats! Wishing you happiness forever." It's too early for that line. So there will be a time eventually. I'll say it again then. You better let me say it, or else. Oh, wait. Steve was a little flustered. I was laughing. Everyone was laughing. It was pure bliss. That was a typical day until a certain point. I was proposed to for the second time in my life. Of course, I accepted the proposal. I was determined to find happiness this time, and I believed that I could be truly happy with Steve. So I headed over to my parents' house for the first time in a while. They were thrilled. I told them everything about Steve, and they said, "Please make our daughter happy. I promise I'll make Catherine happy." He replied with firmness and confidence. We chatted for a while. Then my dad hesitantly said, "Sophie and Bob are going to get married." They said an invitation might come, but I didn't need to stress over it. I wasn't bothered anyway, because I was happy too. In fact, I wanted to flaunt my happiness. When I told my parents that, they said, "If Catherine says so, Steve, we're counting on you if anything happens." A few days later, an invitation to Sophie's wedding arrived. I decided to attend, of course. I responded saying that both of us would be attending. Steve and I had only legally married because Sophie was planning her wedding. We figured it would put too much pressure on our parents and relatives if we had our weddings back to back. We had vowed to have our wedding ceremony once things had settled down. On the day of Sophie's wedding, Steve and I were heading to the venue together. We were reunited with Sophie and Bob, whom we haven't seen in a long time. Bob looked somewhat worn out. During the family introductions, I introduced Steve, saying, "This is my husband, Steve. I'm very proud of him." For some reason, Sophie was visibly surprised when I introduced Steve, which was memorable. On the other hand, I had something I desperately wanted to ask Bob. What had happened between him and Sophie on the day when neither my parents nor I were around? Initially, Bob found it hard to talk, but gradually began to share. Apparently, when Sophie called him on that day and he learned that I was suddenly ill, Bob decided to wait for me. Sophie then came in with strong liquor, saying it would be a waste not to enjoy. Bob, not a heavy drinker, had a couple of drinks and ended up getting drunk. Then, according to him, Sophie saw her chance and started to seduce him. Bob was too drunk to make sound judgments, so he gave in to her advances. Sophie was stunning. In addition, she had a great figure, so it's understandable for a regular guy to fall for her advances. Even so, Bob and I were engaged. However, Bob succumbed to the temptation, and from that point on, he started to pay attention to Sophie. Even after sharing this story, Bob kept apologizing to me, but at that moment, he seemed like such a small man to me. Honestly, I couldn't have cared less. I was just relieved to know the truth. Meanwhile, Steve and Sophie were talking about something. I was curious about it, but since Sophie's wedding was imminent, I decided to ask later. On the way home, I asked Steve, "Were you a bit upset when you were talking to Sophie?" "Well, as I told you before, she was my ex who betrayed me, and that's not all. She's the reason why I lost my job." I was utterly surprised. What a small world. Moreover, the fact that she was the cause of the closure of Steve's shop made it even more shocking. I decided to dig deeper. Apparently, a few months after Sophie started dating Steve, she had an affair with a certain designer. It seems Sophie thought it would be more beneficial for her to date someone in the modeling industry, even though she was dating Steve. Upon accidentally discovering this fact, Steve naturally got angry at Sophie. But Sophie in turn got angry at him, and they broke up. However, Sophie's anger didn't subside, and she created a fake photo of foreign objects in the dishes taken at Steve's restaurant and shared it on social media. At the time, Sophie was also doing some model work, so she had quite a few followers, and the photo spread rapidly. It even caught the attention of Steve's boss, who had left the business to him. Due to the decreased revenue, the restaurant ended up closing. As a result, Steve was fired, bearing the responsibility. Naturally, he held a grudge against this incident. However, since he didn't know who was responsible, he didn't know where to direct his anger. In the midst of all this, he learned the truth when a friend invited him for a drink. A friend of Steve's girlfriend happened to know Sophie and had seen her bragging on social media about causing a restaurant to close. Of course, Steve's friend didn't know that the now closed shop was Steve's. Steve, who unexpectedly found the culprit, could no longer do anything, so he decided to start over in a different place. That's when he met me. I apologized to Steve. "I'm sorry for the horrible things my sister did. Honestly, I'm the sister of the person who messed up Steve's life. I didn't know what to do. I seriously thought that Steve might hate me." But Steve said, "It's in the past, and it's not your fault, Catherine." I was honestly relieved. And once again, we decided to be happy together. Later, Sophie was finally punished. Sophie was going to do a photo shoot, and the place she visited for the shoot, it was our home, of all places. Indeed, it was rich in greenery and likely to take good pictures. Sophie seemed to be considering becoming a model, using this photo shoot as a stepping stone. The incident occurred at a restaurant she visited for dinner. That restaurant was none other than Steve's. I wasn't working at Steve's place anymore, so I heard about it later. As soon as they entered, both Steve and Sophie recognized each other. And immediately, Steve said, "I'm sorry, I can't let you enter," and refused Sophie's group from entering. Of course, the staff got angry and asked what was going on. Steve explained everything, what Sophie had done in the past and the hardships he had endured because of her. "She has a criminal record, and I have solid evidence. I don't want to go through the same thing again, so I refuse to let her enter." No one could say anything, and Sophie seemed to have turned pale. Furthermore, Steve said he would tell the president of the company Sophie was about to join about her past. The person who scouted Sophie was shocked and asked Steve to quit. But Steve's anger didn't subside. In the end, Sophie's photo shoot was canceled, and the incident spread in the industry, crushing her dream of becoming a model. Nobody wants to deal with a person who caused such a huge scandal in the past. On top of that, I heard from my mom that Bob's company's performance has been getting worse recently, and now he's a candidate for a demotion. She seemed worried about what would become of these two in the future. Despite such an incident, Steve and I were spending happy days as usual. And today is our long-awaited wedding. Steve and we both had some hard times in the past, but now we are very happy. There was also a new life in my belly. Congratulations! Wishing you a lifetime of happiness. The crew from the shop where we first met are laughing and repeating this familiar phrase. Thank you. And so, in front of everyone, Steve and I vowed to always cherish our family and be happy forever.